Hello and welcome to The Digital Insight, the technology, procurement and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those who are leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Hello and welcome to The Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO Strategy and Interface magazines. Today, I'm joined by Lance Younger, Managing Director of Inverto, and Jonathan Singh, Project Manager at Inverto. In this episode, we discuss how, as the spotlight is well and truly shining on the function, COVID-19 will represent a defining moment in the history of procurement, while also playing a key role in deciding its future. Hi everybody, welcome to the show.
Hi there, Dale. It's great to be here as well.
Hi.
Thanks for having us.
So one thing I always like to do is so that our listeners know exactly who we're talking to, is to just introduce yourselves a little bit. Tell us a little bit about who you are, your current roles with Inverto, but also a little bit about your experience and your kind of journeys, particularly in the procurement space.
Yeah, fantastic. Maybe a couple of minutes on Inverto itself, actually, because Inverto are kind of one of the industry's best kept secrets. Established about 20 years ago now, specialists in procurements, acquired by Boston Consulting Group 3 years ago, and have grown quite exponentially over that 3-year period. Again, concentrating just on procurements, everything from cost programs through to supply management programs through to risk optimization as well. And got a team of over 200 people across Europe with 20-30% growth a year. So, quite an exciting environment to be in. And me, Lance Young, I joined just over a year ago now to run the UK team. My background is procurement as well, but fortunate enough to be involved in quite a few sort of transformational roles, both in industry for people like Nissan and Goldman Sachs, through to consulting with Ernst & Young and Deloitte, and also running Ariba's consulting team in Europe, and running a couple of startups. So the common thread is it's always about procurement and always about sort of transformation, working with sort of teams and technology there as well.
Hi, this is then Jonathan Singh, also from Inverto. So I've joined the organization 5.5 years ago. Prior to that, I was working already in procurement in the automotive industry for Honda for 3.5 years. And then in procurement, I am primarily focusing on cost out programs into the industrial good industries, but retail as well across primarily, I would say, indirect, but also direct goods. And I've specialized also in the collaboration type approach with suppliers to drive additional value.
No, fantastic. And it's quite clear then you've both got some really incredible experience there, which links quite nicely to sort of what I always like to ask everybody about. We talk a lot about procurement and how procurement has changed, particularly in terms of companies are now waking up to procurement. They're recognizing procurement is much more than a simple additional function, or as someone once described it, the guys who sign the checks. Looking over your experience and over your careers, how have you seen that conversation change firsthand? How, you talked about transformation. That's something we hear a lot of now. How, to put it bluntly, how has procurement changed, in the last 5 years and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, procurement's gone on a fantastic journey, and I think that's accelerating somewhat exponentially at the minute. Where we started was very much on a price orientation. Then it became price and cost, and then the turn of the century, it effectively started to become more about risk, and that was associated with everything from the financial crisis to the sort of the dot-com boom. And then more recently, we've seen innovation come to the fore as well. And innovation, being driven by suppliers. Not something new, but again, the growth of the importance of innovation has been significant over the last 5 to 10 years. And then probably the last thing that's coming through is sustainability, and quite a wide agenda, covering everything from CO2 footprint to fraud in the supply chain to child labor and those sorts of aspects. But sustainability for us is the next, and potentially I think the biggest thing that procurement will be involved in. And maybe hanging around a little bit on that note is the change we've seen in the last 6 months in terms of the amount of effort that organizations are putting into sustainability has been almost exponential, whether it be the budgets that people are spending or the headcount that's been allocated or the initiatives that people are doing in and around the sustainable procurement space. So the transformation has been quite fast over the last 5 to 10 years. And also, I think the other dimension is one of complexity. So it's become even more complex in terms of how organizations are working together across internally, but also across supplier networks as well.
And something you mentioned there, and it brings an interesting point. You talked about sustainability, particularly in the last 6 months, and that's speaking to a number of procurement professionals, and obviously through this podcast and through other forms. Sustainability is not necessarily something that immediately comes up each and every time. I feel like in the grand scheme of, I hate to use the expression, what things are considered sexy in business, sustainability always seems to sort of fall off a little bit in favor of other things such as tech and innovation and even in the word transformation. I'm trying to, when we do talk about transformation and we talk about procurement and what's going on, how do you break that down? How do you break down these kind of buzzwords, these buzz phrases that everyone likes to see, and try and understand what transformation means for, because it's obviously going to be different for each and every business. Like, how do you even begin to break that down and understand, well, this is what we need and this is what's important to us. Let's ignore what everyone else is doing for the sake of everyone else.
Yeah. It's a very, very topical thing, because ultimately you only have so much time and so much resources to be able to align behind your own personal transformation. We completed a bit of research just before Christmas, which was released more recently, on the link between procurement purpose and performance. Because what we saw and what we work with clients on is this alignment of saying, if my business focus is one of cost out, cost optimization, lean processes, because I'm in a manufacturing environment, then everything within the procurement organization needs to flow and be aligned behind that. So in that particular environment, if you're in a manufacturing environment, then you need to build, you need to have roles that are defined as, commercial engineer, cost engineer, target cost analyst, analytics that supports, cost and deep cost, appraisal. You then need individual capability and technology that supports that, and ultimately metrics that are aligned in around cost, as opposed to an organization that's maybe more leaning towards product innovation, product development, like a Nike, for example, where that's what the ultimate customer wants. They want the next new product design, and therefore the procurement function needs to have its capabilities aligned behind achieving that. And organizations that are achieving that alignment are basically outperforming their peers. So you're right, transformation is a broad word, but ultimately you need to define it within your organization and ultimately within procurement, so that you know what you're not doing as much as you know what you're doing as well.
Do you think it's a difficult balancing act then? Because while the appetite is there to embrace change, to transform, to shift the focus and look at procurement completely differently, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be that desire to keep costs down and to focus on savings and efficiencies. Is it quite the tough balancing act then to because obviously people are going to want to move to that new approach, but they don't want to kind of abandon, for lack of a better word, that focus on saving money.
Yeah, and I don't think people should. I think the core role of procurement is cost. It's commerciality. It's being entrepreneurial. It's looking at the price element of what organisations deliver. So first and foremost, procurement functions need to get that right. And then depending on the organization, then you're able to kind of push beyond that to start focusing on other things. And there's some organizations that embrace that, and it'll be part of the CFO's mandate to look at risk as well. So it becomes an open door for procurement to kind of push beyond cost and into risk. But in many organizations, it relies upon procurement to push and to champion that agenda, whether it's risk or whether it's innovation. And then ultimately as well, there's a big decision for individuals to take, because you'll join an organization and you'll be wanting to not only deliver on cost but also deliver on innovation, and you've then got to commit to that or not, because in some instances the organization is either not going to be ready, they're not going to have the appetite, or they're not going to have the ambition for you and your team to be doing more than just cost. And that therein comes a big decision whether or not you decide to push it further or you decide to kind of do it somewhere else.
So jumping back a few steps in, at the very start, you'd said that Inverto is sort of like the best kept secret. I kind of want to pick that apart a little bit before we continue. Why? What makes Inverto sort of the industry's best kept secret?
I think primarily because we've kind of grown rapidly in one market in Germany, and so potentially if you speak to a few of our clients in Germany, they'll say, oh, we know all about you, but in reality, it's only outside of Germany. It's been basically only over the last 3 to 4 years, maybe a bit more, than we've been working with clients outside of that. The other thing I think is the combination of BCG and Inverto, because what we've got at the minute is we've got a very high degree of operational excellence in the procurement space, able to work with and work hands-on with our clients in around procurement problems, whether it be supplier risk programs, whether it be cost out programs, whether it be innovation. But with the BCG element of it, so the second element of it, we're able to kind of do that it might be in a post-merger integration environment, it might be in a turnaround environment, it might be part of a broader sort of supply chain strategy. So clients, we get the best of both worlds. We get depth when it comes to procurement expertise, but also we get breadth, insight, sponsorship because of the BCG team as well.
Let's look then at as we speak today, of course, then the big issue, the big talking point, of course, is COVID-19, and just how much that's impacted both, the world in terms of life and death, but also economically and business-wise. As a procurement professional then, and obviously speaking with procurement professionals, if you can, as best as possible, what has sort of been the general reaction? What have you seen in terms of the way organizations and professionals have reacted to the severe disruption that we're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, there's a couple of things I've been really impressed with, things that I've kind of stepped back from it and thought, wow, that's really, really impressive. One is the speed by which teams were able to mobilize their plans, their actions, core teams, to get up and running. And undoubtedly, there's a good proportion of lessons learned from previous crises, and whether they be just regionally specific with Japan and Hurricane Sandy and others, through to basically the resilience that actually exists within procurement functions. speed is one thing that's impressed me. The other thing that's impressed me is, as a profession, how we've been able to collaborate cross company and cross sector as well. And you've seen quite a few of these collaborations being put into effect. Dropping aside any competition that exists to ultimately to solve problems that exist with individual companies, or basically just simply as providing protection for individuals as well. So that's really impressed me and us. At the same time, we've seen a very, very rapid look at risk and supply risk. And in the short period, in the short term, so January and February, we saw a lot of people addressing some of their initial supply risks very, very quickly. What we're seeing now, though, is almost the second wave. We're in lockdown, and indeed some countries coming out of lockdown. And organizations are, I think, starting to kind of struggle a little bit with what next. Some aren't, but some are, because the what next is a little bit unknown. It's not as severe as COVID when it started, which it was very much a hammer to what was happening. Whereas now we're going into what we're calling a bit of a dance, where as restrictions on COVID are relaxed, people are looking to understand what that means in terms of future demands, future cost profiles and the like. So this is a bit more of an uncertain period that we're heading into, and many organizations are still a little bit uncertain about what they do to operate at scale as they come out of lockdown.
And you mentioned at the start there about how a few things that you've been impressed by, as both yourself personally, but also professionally as part of your business, that you've been impressed in terms of the reaction of many, and the speed and the sort of the reaction and the resilience of certain people, organizations. How important is it because of, you said, the severity, the impact obviously has softened a little bit from when it first started, but it's still obviously there. How important is it to try and focus on the good, the good things that are happening, the opportunity that we're all having to reflect, and that we can, sort of see how our best laid plans and everything that we've sort of spent years championing in the profession now being put to a test and obviously coming up good? Like, how important is it, as best as possible, to focus on them and not kind of focus on, like you just said, that dance and that uncertainty?
Yeah, I think it's an imperative. We've statistically shown, and others have statistically shown, that, well, the two things. One is, there's 14% of companies will effectively thrive. They'll come out of this better than they went in. Their growth curves will be more significant. And so, for many organizations, we need to be concentrating on how do you become one of those companies that thrives, doesn't just thrive, survive. The other thing we've statistically shown is that those organizations that act first tend to outperform their peers as well. So with those two things in mind, it means that procurement in particular needs to look and understand what it should be focusing on to come out of COVID better, stronger. And a relatively easy one for organizations to focus on is digitalization. And what we look to do to improve our organizations across the board. And COVID's act as such a catalyst for that at the very basic level. The number of different tools that people are using, from Teams through to Skype, through to Zoom, that we've been able to scale and operate a new way of working, which is synonymous with being digital and synonymous with being agile. And it's how we look to continue to embody that digital into what we're doing will be one of the key enablers, and a key positive. Going back to the original question, a key positive for us as we come out of COVID.
And you've hit a few points there about digitalization, and one of the things about current working situation is a lot of people now are working remotely. You're no longer in the same office, you're no longer down the hall from other parts of the business. When we talk about, but when you hear people talk about when we come out of this, when we return back to normal, that normal isn't going to be the same. Whatever was normal is no longer going to be what it once was. This is a very broad question, and I know it's going to be a very difficult question because no one knows the answer. But can procurement ever go back to what it was? Are we going to see more? These changes that are happening throughout procurement, are they going to be permanent, or do you think over time we might just revert back to kind of traditional, or not necessarily traditional, but the approaches and the processes that we'd spent the last few years getting to? Are we just going to revert back to those?
No, I think we should use the process we've got to as a base to move forward, but move forward quicker. So if for example, we've put in a process for buying or engaging with suppliers, it's testing. Sorry, it's using COVID as an example of it's a live test of were those processes fit for use. So to give you a couple of examples, if you look at how quickly people have adopted some of the digital collaborative platforms, they've not done that in months. They've done it in days. Now, historically, IT, information security requirements, onboarding requirements would have meant that it would have been months before that bit of technology was approved to be used. So what we've proven is your processes don't need to take that long. So let's keep the integrity of the process you put in place, but understand how we improve the speed of the process that you're going through. And it's the same when you look at levels of communication with critical suppliers. You've demonstrated how you can basically not only increase the intensity of communication with your critical suppliers, but also increase the speed of decision making with your critical suppliers. So how do you keep that new best practice in place? So you're building upon what you had in the past, but improving on it going forward.
And that's a key point there, of course, the supplier relationships, because the way that you communicate with suppliers now is again dramatically different. I spoke to somebody who worked in the financial space recently, and he was beaming about how it's removed not necessarily the complexity of communication, it's kind of removed sort of fear of communication, because at the end of the day, you're speaking to somebody now making these huge decisions, but you're both sitting in a kitchen, or you're both sitting, in a comfortable environment, and it removes that initial sort of layer of, I don't want to say complexity, but that kind of, I guess the obvious answer is yes, but again, are those supplier relationships ever is that going to unlock different efficiencies or different value that was never there before, or perhaps would have taken months to get to, purely because of the way that communication has changed?
I think it will actually change moving forward, simply because of the ways of working is changing so dramatically. So, with every crisis, there is always something that changes and that remains. And maybe in this case, I'm saying maybe because we don't know for sure, communication is one of them with the supplier. And because now you have to slot time to communicate every single day, that communication is also much more frequent, and sometimes it's both formalized and informal, because you have to create those maybe time slots because everyone's working remotely, so you need to create that space, but that space is created regularly, so you can always have that drumbeat with your suppliers. And maybe this is something that's going to be remaining in terms of the relationship itself, in terms of business relationship. I think the focus is also going to be changing moving forward, because I think a lot of the transaction, especially with procurement, depending on the categories, obviously, and the suppliers, can be quite transactional. And because of COVID and the implications that it has, moving forward, if you look at immediate term and long term, I think immediate term, the focus will change from having those potentially hard discussions on price, but focus more on the availability at first. And then in the medium term, using that experience to probably, use those experience and drive value out of it. So cost, but in different ways, as opposed to purely looking at commercial. They might look at driving further efficiencies, driving different operating model, also looking at alternative supply of the supplier, just to make sure that risk do not happen again. So this is also an opportunity for procurement professionals to learn, with their suppliers, to work slightly differently moving forward post-crisis, because the issues that COVID is teaching or showing everyone is really an eye-opener now. So of course the relationship with the supplier will have to change to make sure it future-proofs itself in many ways.
And what about internally? So we've already sort of touched upon how procurement has evolved from an internal perspective, about how management looks at it, about how the wider business looks at what procurement is, and part of these transformation journeys in recent years and beyond and longer than that, a key part of those have been kind of centralizing and becoming more engaged with other areas of the business, so that everybody understands, and it's not just one responsibility, it now becomes shared responsibilities and that sort of thing. Obviously, we want moving forward that to continue and that to improve, but there is surely then, will there be a reaction at the moment and for the foreseeable of, I don't want to say panic, but obviously businesses are going to try to kind of look to survive rather than look to grow in this current sort of period, so that might push that evolution back a little bit. Do you think that's something we're going to see, or perhaps it will just carry on, strategically growing and evolving?
Well, it's going to somehow. We've done a survey recently as well on COVID-19 and how businesses would react, and actually what we find is that, and interestingly, 70% of participants actually don't necessarily plan to support the supply chain, which could be at first a negative outlook, but actually what it says is also at the same time, businesses are trying to build a response to crisis and will modify their supply chain. So, more than a little bit less than half of the participants are essentially planning to change their supply chain or have crisis response procedure in place.
I think the critical thing here is there's an inflection point where people go from, as Jonathan was saying, doing the base things. So reacting to COVID, putting a crisis team, putting in place a plan, doing the scenario planning, and all of that sort of good stuff, executing on that plan, but then going back to the second point, and probably the most important, is then being very deliberate about how they can use that as a platform to rebound, or platform to grow, or platform to be strategic. Because yes, procurement is well positioned to focus on the issues at hand, which is cost and risk. You're very well situated. But if they just focus on those two things, then they'll come out of COVID in exactly the position that they went into COVID, and may take a step a little bit back, because, especially when they're looking to move forward. However, if they use that as a base to move forward and basically accelerate, as we talked about, digital, or accelerate deeper relationships with suppliers on innovation, then that is going to be where they're going to basically drive the biggest amount of opportunity.
Yeah, and you've already touched upon this earlier when we talked about sustainability, but again, and this is just talking from experience, where that's been something that's I've had to bring that up for that to be even mentioned. It never seems to enter the conversation naturally. What will this period do in terms of broadening the focus of procurement? So not shifting it, but just broaden it so that people will start talking about something such as sustainability more than they may have done in the previous years. Like, what will it do for that?
Yeah, it's funny, because I think, yes, it will act as a catalyst in a way, but I think it was going to be a catalyst anyway. If COVID hadn't happened, then there are so many things happening at the minute with regards to the environment, whether it comes down to social issues, that mean that sustainability and procurement's role in that is going to be imperative. And we saw it last year, as I said before, budgets changing, but also the procurement title changing as well. So when risk was emerging as something for procurement, you didn't see procurement's title change to chief risk or chief third-party risk manager. It just happened. Whereas last year we saw 4 or 5 CPOs, their titles changed to being Chief Procurement and Sustainability Officer. And they're in big organizations, whether it be like Babcock, like in ABM InBev. And so that change was coming. I think once we get through COVID, people will be, it will become prevalent again, and then the scope and scale of it will become a bit driven depending upon which type of organization you're in. If you're in manufacturing, and you've got a big footprint and you're consuming, lots of carbon driving raw materials, then that will become an issue. If you've got a very, very long supply chain that's touching on and accessing other types of raw materials, then that's going to become another issue around origination and provenance. If you've got a supply chain that's basically heavily labor impacted, you've got a double-edged sword here. COVID has basically accentuated those industries that have got a huge amount of people in their supply chains. And now people are saying, how does COVID impact that supply chain that's got people in? But also it accentuates the people element from a sustainable procurement perspective, whether it be working conditions through to payments and wage levels, and so you've kind of got, I think you've got a bit of a double storm happening, and 2 reasons to kind of be spending more time and focusing more on sustainable procurement.
Yeah, and what if we've talked about it a lot already? But what of risk assessments? Because almost seemingly unbelievably, when I've spoken to somebody literally, over the weekend, and I've said, they're talking about their risk assessments, they sort of confessed that, as little as 12 months ago, risk assessment was almost 10 on their top 10 priorities. And obviously right now, I think that's going to be flipped on its head, and I think everybody's going to be focusing on risk assessments moving forward. What have you seen in that regard then, in terms of now, perhaps they always thought, yes, a risk assessment's important, but it's almost, even to those people who have absolutely prioritized their risk assessments, has this made them open their eyes to gaps that they didn't even know they had?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, it's unfortunate, I think, for the person you're probably speaking to. The reason why it was probably number 10 on the list was because the 9 ahead of it were very, very important, and potentially she doesn't have the capacity in the team to be able to do everything. So it's a prioritization activity. But what we've seen is, as I said at the start, a significant focus to start off with in the COVID crisis on risk and the assessment of ensuring supply and ensuring that the right suppliers and the right products are being supplied on time. What we've seen already, but we'll continue to see, is a risk-adjusted approach, where organizations will need to understand the inherent risk associated with a commodity or material or service they buy. So that's the risk that's going to be always there, versus a risk and issue that pops up because of maybe a particular supplier's performance. And that the rigor by which that's applied, yes, undoubtedly will become more. I think tied to that as well, you'll see a greater emphasis on business continuity planning, and then also scenario planning to support that. So this is where organizations are looking even deeper into their supply chain to understand what the implications are and what they need to do in terms of either holding excess stock or having resilience in their supply chain by having dual sources, through to contractually what are the implications of force majeure, because that will happen. So I'd linger a little bit on that word risk-adjusted approach. I think that's what we're seeing applied, is a bit more intelligence into the risk-adjusted approach to risk assessments, risk management, risk processes, BCP, and the like.
To answer your question, around, is there a gap? I mean, what we've observed with some of the businesses is that, yes, there is a gap, because after the COVID crisis, basically some of the projects shift focus towards understanding what were the risks in their supply chain, and were they going to be able to assemble, produce some of the goods, which means they didn't know it before the crisis because they didn't have the countermeasures in place in some cases.
And we can't obviously predict the future as much as we can forecast, and we can use data and understand it and think about it as best as possible. But looking to the future then, in terms of, so imagine if you were starting out your career now, if you were to, someone was learning their trade and rising through the ranks as a procurement professional, will this year and however long COVID lasts be something that's going to be spoken out possibly for the rest of time in terms of how it's impacted and changed, and a phrase someone used earlier was ripped up the supply chain rule book? Like, is this something that we're going to be using as a key moment in history for the future of procurement?
I think absolutely. I think primarily because it provides what's the best way of putting it? I'll use the word catalyst, but it's something that magnifies the reason why procurement exists. Whether that be the intensity of focus around cost and the commercial role of being able to drive and understand what makes up cost. What are the components, what are the drivers, what are the indices, and how can you understand in detail, through to the relationships that you need to have in place to be able to deliver both internally, but also capture and build on externally those ideas. So I think right here, right now is a catalyst for procurement and for people in the procurement industry. If I was to kind of articulate or rip up the book, as you're saying, I'd almost be really stepping back from it, because when we start the call, we talked about what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years, and we've seen how procurement has gone from looking at commercial to risk to innovation, sustainability. The topics that we cover are incredibly dynamic. So in 10 years' time, there'll be something else we'll be looking at, but procurement will still be looking at it. We'll still be working with suppliers to basically ensure that whatever the topic is, that we're able to bring it to bear within our organizations. And I guess the reason why I mention that is, we can look at these different topics, but fundamentally it's an individual's skills as a negotiator, as a facilitator, as an integrator, as a communicator, collaboration. Those skills are imperative to be able to develop, because then you can then work in risk, or you can work in innovation, or you can work somewhere else. So core behavioral collaboration skills are kind of an imperative for somebody starting out on their career now.
Looking at what you've seen then so far in terms of the reaction, in terms of the response, the speed of which procurement and organizations have mobilized and responded and kind of continued operating. Again, as we said earlier, most of these changes are going to be permanent. But if there's one thing that you've seen so far that you hope, if everything had to return to normal, again, whatever normal is anymore, if there was one change that you've seen that you could keep, and because it's obviously improved for the better, what would that one change be?
I think in general is the agility and the resilience. So the ability to respond fast, take decisions as well, fast, and not, it's important to have processes, but have the right processes that allow you to really make the right decisions to be more competitive in a more and more dynamic environment.
Yeah, and for me, it would be leadership. I think you can basically, the success or failure of a team, a company, a procurement department will and is defined by leadership. And we'll see during this period, but also going forward, those leaders that are able to basically unlock gridlock, are able to communicate. They're able to be strategic, and at the same time as being collaborative, to basically move beyond inertia and engender imagination are all going to be critical things. So leadership at times of crisis and beyond is going to be an imperative for me.
And final question then, which you've kind of just answered, but I always like to ask everybody who comes on the show, not obviously as a guarantee of success, because there is no guarantee of success, but obviously based on your experience, based on what you see on a day-to-day basis, what has been and will always remain kind of a crucial element to achieving any form of success in procurement? Whether that's people, whether that's communication, just what was one thing that if it's one piece of advice that you could tell yourself when you were younger starting out procurement, what would it be?
Well, for me, I personally think you need to believe in it yourself. It needs to be something that you've got a belief in it. It's something which is aligned with what your passion is, aligned with where your ambitions sit, aligned with your own personal values. Because if you've got that that genuine passion for it, then it's amazing what you'll do to kind of tip something up over the line. And that listen, that can be a passion for procurement, but also maybe a passion for the company that you're working with and what the company does. It might be a passion for a particular project in time. You talk about sustainability and that having a certain amount of meaning. But I think if you don't have that passion, then you need to kind of shift the project a bit, shift your intent a bit, move business, either within the business or beyond. But if you don't have it, then you need to find it somewhere.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with the Interface.net and CPOstrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate and review. And don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/The Digital Insight.